So, this course is about sex and the Enneagram. Now, I think that all of you know the Enneagram very well, and I don't need to explain anything about the types, instincts, or levels of development or anything like that. But what about sex? I mean, if you want to understand the nexus between the Enneagram and human sexuality, or how the types and instincts influence our sexual lives, you need to know something about sex as well. And you may have 10, 20, 30, maybe 40 years of sexual experiences. But does that make you knowledgeable about sex? I mean, you may see lots of sexual issues on TV, right? I mean, there's sex in movies, there is lots of sexuality and nudity in commercials. You may be watching porn, you may look at some kind of erotic literature and journals. But does that make you knowledgeable about sex? I think not. I think actually, as a matter of fact, in our contemporary society that is so much knowledge-based, we don't know much about sex. And why is that? Well, actually, the discipline, the scientific or academic discipline of sexology is pretty new. Until the late 19th century, everything people knew about sex was actually knowledge that was transferred within the realm of spirituality and religion. And it's only in the late 19th and maybe early 20th century that the first scientists really started carrying out some kind of objective study about sex. And this continued in the early 20th century, and the main first impetus came in the 1940s with Alfred Kinsley. He was the first real major researcher in the field of sex. Basically, he carried out massive research with hundreds of thousands of participants. And in the following decades, you had many others. For example, Masters and Johnson were very famous as well. And this continued until the late 1990s, and actually in the early 2000s or so, suddenly had a mushrooming of researchers on sex and sexuality. Now, this means that we have about 1 century of academic research, which is actually very, very short if we're looking in terms of other scientific disciplines. Now, you could say that 100 years is a lot and that we have gathered a lot of information, and that's definitely true. But what do we know about human sexuality? Actually, not that much, because most what we know is about sexuality of the middle class in the industrialized world. Because what about sex of hunter-gatherers? What about sex 50,000 years ago? What about sex of the ancient Egyptians or the Incas or the Mayans? We don't know that much about it. And as a result, what we do know about sex, or what we claim to know about sex, is very much focused on a specific time era and specific values. So in this lesson, I have 2 objectives. The first objective is to make sure that you have a basic knowledge about human sexuality, because without that, it'll be much more difficult to understand the rest of the classes. It would still be interesting, but you would not fully grasp, you would not understand lots of nuances. And the second thing that I want to show is that not everything about sex can be explained through the Enneagram. The main thing here is sexual values. Our values or our attitudes or norms about oral sex, masturbation, non-monogamy, they're not based or dominated by the views of our type. They're just a matter of values, and values change over time. So how am I going to teach this lesson? I will basically give you some kind of alternative history course, and I hope that by the end of this class you will wish that your history teacher was teaching in a similar way as I did today. But I will give you some kind of history class that really focuses on the sex lives or the sexual lifestyles of our ancestors. And in order to give some structure to that, I'm going to use the conceptual model of spiral dynamics. Some of you may be familiar, some may not. If you're not, don't worry. It's not that important that you know spiral dynamics already. But spiral dynamics is basically giving some structure to the evolution of values of humanity. So I'm going to use that framework partially. I will not follow it in a very orthodox manner, but it's going to give you some structure. Now, basically, I'm going to look at 7 stages of development. And in each of these stages, I will discuss each time 6 very specific topics. The first one is about marriage and sex. The second one is prostitution. The third topic is sexual orientation and gender identity. Fourth is sexual education. Fifth, sex and spirituality. And finally, sexual values. Now, as I go through this course or this lesson, it's important that you are non-judgmental. There are no good or bad values. There are no right or wrong values. You shouldn't look at it in terms of like progressive or backward, because don't forget that in 200, 300 years from now, maybe people will look in a very judgmental way at us and tell that we were backward with our sexual values or the way we had our sexual lifestyle. So, as I will be giving this alternative history class, please sit down, relax, just take in the information and try to notice what your body senses, what your heart feels, and which kind of thoughts and ideas cross your mind. Because it's very important that you understand what your sexual values are and why you have these values. This is going to be really important in order to dig deeper and look at how your specific type deals with these values.